because even if there's only 10 people watching, the taped version over the next 3 weeks might be watched by 1,000 people.
Correct.
So you better have your A game.
It's up to 11 now, 11 attendees. That's double your number, Tom. 12.
Yeah.
14.
That's because his whole family is watching.
Yeah.
And we have 6 and climbing, it looks like, here on YouTube.
So, Dan, should everybody stop their video? Go into stealth.
Sure thing.
So,
Dan, should everybody stop their video? Patty and Daryl, do you guys want to kill your video? So Barry, you're going to stay on through the opening remarks here, and
yeah, and then I'll still my video after that
okay.
when I introduce Clem, and then I'll come back on. I think it'd be helpful if the speakers did turn their video on. When, either now or when they come on.
Is that the same for if you give us the question to answer, Barry, should we turn on our video?
I think so.
Okay.
Looks like we've settled out at about 25 people, so should we go ahead and get started? Or you want to wait another couple minutes? I have 7:01.
Say, give it a couple minutes.
That's a good idea, because people may have difficulty coming on. Folks, if you're joining us on YouTube this evening, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're getting the last of things set up, and we're giving the last of our participants and those coming online to watch live stream an opportunity to get signed in and get settled in. So we'll be starting in just a couple minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our potential regionalization of the village and town of Webster Seward plant. This is a joint public informational webinar presentation. We welcome you. Thank you for coming this evening to participate. We have a couple of people from our engineering. Clem Chung will be here from Labella, and Ken Knutson is a senior vice president from Barton and LaJouche. And I am Barry Howard from the Webster Chamber of Commerce. I'll be moderating this evening. And so we would want to just go over a couple of webinar guidelines for you. Please mute your microphone if you have it on. We'll probably do that mostly for you. If you have access to that, just mute your microphone. Use the Q&A down at the bottom. You'll see that circled. Use the Q&A to submit a question anytime during the presentation, but we will be responding at the end of the presentation. We do have a spot set aside for Q&A at the end. And this presentation is on YouTube live stream and will be recorded for website postings, and it'll be posted on the websites, and you'll be able to look at it again on YouTube, so that if you wanted to be able to show it to somebody, or if you wanted to watch it again to catch some piece that you missed, you'll be able to do that into the future, and that'll be posted for quite some time into the future. So I'd like to just tell you a little bit about our presentation objectives for this evening. We want to talk a little bit about the project development history, and then we're going to talk about planned upgrades at both the village wastewater treatment plant, that upgrade, and the town wastewater treatment plant upgrades, phases 1 and phase 2. And then we want to talk about the opportunity, which is the regional wastewater treatment plant upgrades, and then we'll look at some of the monetary considerations and some of the non-monetary considerations. And then we will open it up for questions via the Zoom Q&A function. So if you've got a question, you can go ahead and post it, but we will not be answering questions until we get to the end, to the Q&A section. So let's look a little bit at the timeline. We have 2 treatment plants right now with a single outfall. We have a treatment plant with the town on Phillips Road that handles approximately a capacity of about 5 million gallons per day. The village wastewater treatment plant on the corner of Route 250 and Wall Road can handle about 2.5 million gallons per day. Both plants provide secondary treatment. Both operate under an intermunicipal agreement, an IMA, between the town and the village. And you can see pictures of those 2 plants in that screen, and then the common outfall in the red line that's there. So the timeline was that things started back in 2016. So the sewage treatment plant issues with both the town and the village have been going on for some time in the town. 2016, they did an engineering report. They did phase 1 design, and then construction started in 2019. And phase 1 construction should be completed by December of 2020. At the same time, in 2017, the village began their engineering report, and they did some funding applications in 2018 and in 2019. And then they started in 2020 some in earnest regional versus village only evaluation. And then we can go back also on that regional evaluation. We can look at the fact that there were informal discussions back in 2016. In 2018, there was an October Village workshop with a regional alternative overview. And then there was a village committee formed in 2019. And then in 2020, at the beginning of the year, began the monthly joint project committee meetings, which included representatives from both engineering firms, from the town board and staff, and from the village board of trustees and staff. The next step will be that the village board needs to make a decision, and that's pending into the future. So we've got an idea on the project timelines, and we'll move forward here. And I'm going to introduce Clem Chung from Labella, who's the project manager on the village side, and he will make his presentation now. Thanks, Clem.
Thanks, Barry. So I just wanted to go into a little bit of history behind where the village and town treatment plants have come from and how we got to where we are today. So there's been a village wastewater treatment plant at the current site that's existed since before the 1930s. The oldest drawings we have date back to that decade. The original plant discharged into Mill Creek at the back of the site. The plant was upgraded several times in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1960s, the town and the village came together and agreed to build a joint system with a common outfall into Lake Ontario. At the time, there was a treatment plant both at the town site and the village site that looked very similar. So we'll talk a little bit about the types of treatment systems that are there right now. The one at the village site is called a trickling filter. It's a type of secondary treatment. And the town had a very similar process there. As part of the agreement between the town and the village in the 1960s, 1960s, the village agreed to take over the facilities that were there at the town site, and the town would build a completely different type of treatment system called an activated sludge treatment system at the town site, and the flows would be separately treated through each system, so that the village would still be responsible for treating its flows for the most part, and the town would be responsible for treating its flows. The DEC, or the EPA I should say, required that the town be the entity to obtain what's called a Speedies permit, which allows the municipality to discharge the wastewater after it's been treated back into the environment. So that was the setup that was created. So what happens is there's the two plants at the two sites. The wastewater from the village site goes to or through the town site, and it connects with the wastewater that's been treated in the town plant in a pipe. There is a little bit of treatment that goes on there that's kind of joint. The town adds a disinfection chemical, chlorine, to the discharge from both plants, and then that treated flow goes out into Lake Ontario through a single pipe. So that's the town's responsibility under their Speedies permit. The village has as Barry mentioned, an IMA, an intermunicipal agreement with the town to kind of share that treatment and share the costs of maintaining and operating that system. It has what's called a SOU, or Significant Other User Permit, to the town, which for all intents and purposes has been operated the same way as a Speedies permit. It just isn't liable to the same degree as the town is in terms of having liability to the Department of Environmental Conservation. So in the upgrade or update to the IMA in 1979, there's a description of how the maintenance costs and operation costs are divided between town and the village. There are some components, like I mentioned, that were taken over in its entirety by the village. So that would include the tripping filter and the pumps feeding the tripping filter, for example. So if any upgrades would be needed, it was envisioned that the village would pay 100% for those costs. There are other, if you go back just for a sec, there are other components at the town site which are available for the village components there. So for example, the emergency generator, that if that needed to be upgraded, there would be a division of costs, some kind of cost share between the town and the village for those upgrades. One thing to note about the trickling filter at the town site is soon after the village took it over, they determined that it was not possible to actually operate it the way that it was meant to be operated. So, probably within a year or two, they abandoned the use of it and just kind of used the treatment facility they had at the village site. They found that all of the infrastructure that was there at the village site was enough for them to meet their requirements under the SOU permit. So as Barry mentioned, there were separate evaluations done on the village plant and the town site, and they were both kind of instigated by conditions that were deteriorating at both of the facilities. So I'm going to talk about the village project, and then Ken Knudsen from Barton & Judas will talk about the town's project. So jumping ahead a little bit in history, just some of the more recent things that have led to the condition deterioration at the village site. There was a deteriorating, what we call headwork. So that's the facility at the beginning of the plant that takes out all of the large debris, rags, grit from the wastewater, and protects the downstream processes. So that structure and process was constructed in 2007. Unfortunately, prior to that point, all of that material that hadn't been removed eventually got through the process and started impacting the operation of the anaerobic digester. So in 2015, the village realized it had a problem, and they hired Labella to start looking at the condition of the digester. There were some recommendations for fixes of that and to upgrade the digester. At the time, it was considered an emergency issue, and actually in 2016, it got to the point where the gas piping within the digester broke and caused a safety hazard. So the village had to do something immediately. They couldn't plan for a capital project to upgrade that, but there was a significant price tag to that. So the village asked us to expand the scope of our evaluation to look beyond not just what was needed to upgrade the digester, but what other upgrades would be necessary at the plant, and then also look at whether there would be other alternatives to upgrading the facility. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. One other issue that was pretty significant to how the plant was operated was that there were some odor complaints from the surrounding residents. The village believes that the majority of that came from the operation that they had to compost their sewage sludge. The location on the site was very close to the road, and they were concerned about that was what was causing those odor complaints. So they ceased operations of that in 2015. They also curtailed their leachate and septic receiving operations in 2017 to further help to mitigate those issues. But in the end, there were some additional upgrades that were needed to the plant, upgrades for the plant, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, as I mentioned, there were some alternatives that the village asked us to take a look at to upgrading the plant, and those were potentially taking the flow to the town's plant, and also taking the taking the flows to Monroe County and discharging into their plant at Van Leer, which is near Durand Eastman Park. So the first alternative we looked at was taking it to the town. The way that we envisioned that upgrade was to decommission the village plant and then take the flows through the existing pipe that connects the two sites, and then take it through essentially rehabilitate the village infrastructure that hadn't been working back in the 60s, basically make that more viable. We didn't look very closely at the town's at the treatment process that the town currently uses, because we knew that the town was looking to upgrade their facilities, and we knew that Barton and the Judas was doing their own evaluation. So at this time, we needed to submit a report to start the funding process, and we didn't have time at that point to wait for the other analysis to be concluded at the town plant. So that's kind of what we looked at. If we were to look at what made the most sense, we probably wouldn't have considered that as a viable alternative the way that we had in terms of rehabilitating the village infrastructure at the town plant. So that kind of leads on later to this discussion about the regional alternative. The estimated cost of that analysis was about 11.6 million back in 2017. The other alternative, as I mentioned, was to take the flows to Monroe County. That would include decommissioning the village plant, building a new pump station at the plant, and then connecting to a diversion structure, which currently exists in the town. Some of the flows within the town get diverted to the town plant, and then the rest gets diverted to Monroe County currently. So in order to get that there, we would need to upsize the sewer, we'd need to upgrade one of the county pump stations, which is on the sandbar, pump across Arundequoit Bay outlet, and discharge into a pipe that would take it to the treatment plant. So we communicated with Monroe County and asked them if they felt that there were any upgrades necessary to their infrastructure to facilitate this alternative. And they said they didn't believe that there was anything necessary at the time. So the total estimated cost of that alternative was $10.2 million in 2017. So looking at the biggest change really is with the new administration at the town. They've evaluated the recommended upgrades to the village-only project and said that if the village were to go ahead with those projects, they would require the village to update the IMA and also to obtain their own speedies permit. So in order to acquire that permit, we had a conversation with the Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, and asked them what would we need to add to the original recommendations to make it such that the village could get a speedies permit. Our assumption during the evaluation was that the existing situation with the IMA and the SOU permit would continue. So with those changes, the DEC said, well, you're going to have to increase the redundancy of your secondary process. So in that case, it would mean decommissioning the existing trickling filter, which is kind of oversized for the flows that we currently see, and replace it with two individually smaller units but have the same capacity as a combined unit to treat the flows. We would also need to include disinfection for the village itself. So right now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the town provides that service to the village. This would require an upgrade to the village plan to allow that to happen. So we would be looking at the UV disinfection system to be installed at the end of the treatment process for the village. Then, as we separate out the responsibilities, with the town having its own speedies permit and the village having its own permit, we would need to have a separate sampling location so that we could prove to the DEC that the village was meeting its requirements and complying with its permit. So with all that being said, that increased the overall project cost, and it includes some escalation factors as well from our original estimate in 2017 to when we expect the project, if we were to select this alternative to go ahead, that would start operation in 2023, and the price tag now for the village only project stands at $10.9 million. Now I'll turn it over to Ken to talk about the town's project.
All right, thanks, Clem. So similar to the village of Webster retaining Labella for that evaluation, the town of Webster retained Barton and LaJudas to prepare an agency-compliant preliminary engineering report, kind of in response to some of the critical equipment systems that were starting to fail. This is an aerial photo of the town's wastewater treatment plant, and just to orient you, the infrastructure that Clem was talking about that is owned by the village through the IMA consists of the effluent sewer, the 24-inch that comes from the village treatment plant into the town's plant site and pretty much bypasses the town's treatment process to the common outfall sewer to Lake Ontario. This is an existing trickling filter and a secondary clarifier and associated piping that is owned, operated, and maintained by the village under the current IMA. Within our study, we did a comprehensive evaluation of the majority of the major unit processes operating at the town's treatment plant. The driver for that study were the rectangular secondary clarifiers, and these function to settle out the solids at the end of the treatment process, basically are the last line of defense for meeting permit before the effluent reaches Lake Ontario. Those were in critical condition, and that said, the town opted to divide the recommended improvements up into phases. Phase 1 project, which Barry noted on the timeline, commenced in earnest in 2018 through design, started construction in 2019, and essentially has consisted of the construction of 3 90-foot diameter circular clarifiers to replace 3 pre-existing rectangular clarifiers. This is a fairly substantial project. It's a $12 million project, which the town has secured a $3 million grant for. Progress has been pretty substantial to date. So to orient you here again, this is the effluent sewer from the village treatment plant going to the common outfall sewer, which heads out to Lake Ontario. This was where the rectangular clarifiers were. This is new clarifier 3, new clarifier 2. These are online and operational right now, which has now then allowed the existing rectangular clarifiers to be taken offline. As you see it here, phasing of the project was very important, led to some of the costs of this, but it also allowed the contractor to creatively use the existing clarifiers as support systems for their trenching. You can see that, again, the village's existing clarifier still remains intact. That would be recycled in the future, which I'll get into. We did drop in a new outfall pipe from the town's clarifiers into a new structure. So again, right now the village's effluent comes into the structure treated. The town's effluent comes in here treated. The town chlorinates, and the combined waste goes to Lake Ontario. It's chlorinated. And here's an aerial drone shot of the amount of steel that goes into a 90-foot diameter clarifier, just to give you some perspective on the size of these things. So the the town has progressed that major infrastructure improvement. Some of the ancillary improvements that are also being done here under phase one, intricate to the clarifiers, are withdrawal and pumping of the waste solids that settle out. So they entirely revamped their solids handling pumps, piping and flow meters, and the instrumentation and control, brought that up to date. Basically hardened these pumps against any flooding in the basement where they're located. And in addition to that, as Clem mentioned, the emergency generator, the prior generator at the town plant was woefully undersized, could not keep the aeration system running. This new 800 kilowatt standby generator is large enough to power phase two, as well as the improvements that would be envisioned under a regional option should it go in that direction. So phase two improvements essentially would cover other unit processes beyond the secondary clarifiers, effluent disinfection, the biological treatment process, and additional primary clarifiers, building improvements, and then some fairly substantial improvements to the solids handling or the anaerobic digester system. The cost of phase two, in addition to the current $12 million project, would be another $19.7 million, escalated to $2023. So we're here to speak again about this opportunity of a regional treatment plant. As you can see from photos and history here, these two plants are uniquely configured with a common outfall and a pipe from the village plant that runs right into and adjacent to the town's wastewater treatment plant. So under a regional scenario or concept, as you can see by the pictures here, it's one for all and all for one. Essentially what's depicted down here is, on the treatment side of things, the village and town would essentially drop the corporate boundary, and a sewer user in the village would be treated the same as a sewer user in the town. So in order to facilitate regional treatment, the village's plant would be mostly decommissioned at its current site. There would be a few buildings that could be repurposed for use by the DPW. The administration building would stay intact. We would essentially keep a remote headworks building in order to pull out a lot of the solids and inorganics prior to that primary effluent going into that existing pipe and being redirected into the head of the town's treatment plant. So everything in green, of course, is phase one town. That's nearly complete. Everything in blue is required for a phase two upgrade for the town to achieve, to meet capacity demands for the next 20-year planning period. What would be needed to further expand that to accommodate the flows and loads from the village during the 20-year planning period would be the addition of one more primary clarifier, some piping modifications to intercept the effluent from the village, a new set 90-foot secondary clarifier, as well as slightly upsizing the solids handling facilities in the digesters. And that's essentially it. So that 19.7 cost for a phase two, if we were to now treat the village waste at a regional facility, would increase to a project cost of about $27.7 million. So this is a schematic similar to what Clem had shown. One thing that jumps out at us here again is these two plants have a lot in common. They have the same unit processes with the exception of the form of activated or biological treatment, your activated sludge versus trickling filters. If the town were to proceed on their phase two project, they would increase their capacity from about 5 million gallons up to about 7.4 to accommodate future growth. The village's plant would stay at about 2.5 to handle current flows and loads. They would each have redundant or similar disinfection systems. The village would have a Speedies permit, and they would monitor that flow from their plant, probably right adjacent to that new structure that the town has dropped in under phase one. What also would remain here is you see this red line here. Each entity has its own collection system. Gravity sewers, pump stations that serve the residential, commercial, industrial user base in the town all make their way to the town. Similarly, the village has a collection system. largest users of the two systems is Xerox. And the way their campus is configured and the plants are located, roughly 85 to 90% of the Xerox flows go to the village's wastewater treatment plant, and roughly 10 to 15% of the flow, by virtue of where the pipes go, goes to the town plants. So in a regional concept, again, both plants now function as one. A user of the treatment plant, be it in the town or the village, is treated the same. They're going to pay the same for any debt service and operation and maintenance. So there's some economies there. There's less redundant equipment and so on. In this configuration, however, again with a simple diversion here and maintaining the headworks at the village's site, the collection systems will remain status quo. We don't envision any changes to the Xerox flow patterns, and the costs, which we will discuss, therefore, tonight, are only related to treatment plant, debt service, and operation and maintenance. And Barry is going to take it from there.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate that. So the slide that you're looking at now are some of the monetary considerations, and the first thing that the engineers looked at was what they call the EDU, which is the equivalent dwelling unit, which is about 60,000 gallons per year. And they broke down where that comes from on the town side, which you'll see on the far left bottom pie chart. Right now, about 82% of what goes into the wastewater treatment plant of the town is coming from residential users, residential EDUs. And on the village side, about 60% of what the village processes through the wastewater treatment plant comes from Xerox. And so, obviously, those are a little lopsided, one towards residential, one towards commercial and industrial. And so, if we were to move into a regional wastewater treatment plant, the users would be slightly balanced out. About 65% of the sewage that goes through the plant would be from residential, and about 19% would come from Xerox, and then the rest coming from a portion of Penfield and commercial industrial. I also just want to note that the current town sewer rate is $173 per EDU, and the current village rate is about $150 per EDU. So moving on to the next slide, we can see that we have estimated project costs under the regional and then the village wastewater treatment plant on the right-hand side, and the estimated EDUs, and then the estimated annual debt, and then the operation and maintenance per EDU. And that these numbers are using 2023 as year one because that's how long it would take to get the project, approved and financed and then actually put in. So the estimated approximate sewer rate increase in the year 2023, the town and village would go up about 50% roughly, and the village only would go up around 27%. That's shown a little better in the next chart, which has the alternatives versus. So in 2023, which is the duplicate or the dual bars that you see on the far left-hand side of the project, in 2023, you can see that the village side, which is the treatment village only, and that would be the red and the green, those would be what things looked like in 2023. And the projected village regional costs in that same year, 2023, would be higher in the first year. And then as you move out about 10 years, you'll see that then switches, that the projected village-only costs would then begin to exceed the projected village regional costs, and that just grows as we move through time into the future. So originally, or initially I should say, we would see that the village would not have the increased rate that they would on a regional basis, but eventually that would shift and the regional basis would end up with a smaller EDU or unit or per unit cost for the village users. So I think we want to talk a little bit about the non-monetary considerations in a regional versus a village only. So obviously there's less redundant wastewater treatment infrastructure assets. The town and the village combined are obviously going to separate have two separate sets of assets, and they're going to need to be maintained, they're going to need to be operated. regulatory and funding agency support of regionalization. There is a big push on at the federal and state level for the combining of operations and to regionalize operations. And one of the reasons for that is to decrease infrastructure assets, which decrease infrastructure bonding and costing and operating. There is a capacity for growth. You would see an increase in EDUs. There's a reduced risk and liability. The speedies would be in compliance. The village would have its own and the town would have its own, and they would have their own responsibility for those. There's future revenue opportunities for septage and waste gas to energy that we would be able to have in a regional plant. Then a couple of others are that operators, the availability of operators right now for sewage treatment plants is very, very slim. There aren't a whole lot of people that are going into this career, and so finding people to operate plants is difficult. So in a regional situation, we would only need to have one operator rather than having two operators. And then the last non-monetary is that you can throw a dart at the dartboard and who knows what you'll come up with, but we have an unknown fate of Xerox. Right now, that plant has been shrinking for a number of years, which has been reducing the amount of sewage that's going into the village plant. We don't know whether that'll continue as a decline, whether it'll remain steady, whether it'll increase if that plant gets repurposed, if that campus gets repurposed. So that's one of the non-monetary considerations that we would need to look at. So I think if Ken jumps to the next slide, I think that what we would just talk about next is that if we were to move into a regional wastewater treatment plant, that we would need to have a board decision, and then there would be a memorandum of understanding, and then they would be the project development, and we'd have to go through bonding, and then funding applications and secure funding, and final design and permitting, and then bidding and construction. And so that's where we get the 2023. That process would take. The first two are check marked. We would need to move, or the first three are check marked, and now we move into the next steps. And so that would be what was in the future. Obviously, none of these things happen, quickly, and so that would be why we would need the next 3 years approximately to move into a completed project. So I think that concludes our presentation. Unless we need to jump back to either Ken or Clem for clarification on anything that I spoke about or anything that you wanted to bring back up. If not, then I will go ahead and start to introduce some of the questions that we have. And for those of you that don't know, in addition to Clem and Ken from the engineering firm, Mayor Byerts is on as a presenter and will be able to answer questions. Supervisor Flaherty is on and would be able to answer questions. Councilwoman Cataldi is on from the town. Trustee Ippolito is on from the village. And so we have people from all of the entities. The engineering people have some of their staff on here that could answer some questions. So right now we've got some questions open. So I'm going to see if I can just give me 1 minute to review some of what we have in our question list and see where we want to start. So I guess the first question that I want to address is this a regional treatment plant or simply a larger town plant? So I'm going to ask maybe Ken to talk about that on the town side and why we would call it a regional plant instead of just saying it's a bigger town plant.
Sure. That is good. It's a good question, and certainly just by geographic location, one may tend to think it's a town plant, although noting that the village plant is located within the town. I focused a little bit on that little graphic that had the IMA, the two people pushing the puzzle together. Our experience with similar joint projects, which have actually included more than two municipalities, is you're not going to do the project unless it benefits everyone. And there's another question up here that's going to speak to funding. The village brings funding opportunities. A regional project brings funding opportunities. The structure of the governing body for this wastewater treatment plant would take the the form of a JPC, similar to the JPC that's been formed to date to vet the project and look at alternatives. Typically, we would see that body stay together to craft an intermunicipal agreement that basically frames the ownership, operation, and maintenance, the cost sharing, anything related to the operation, the long-term operation and maintenance of this plant is being vetted and developed by both municipal boards with input from their respective attorneys. Eventually, if a consensus is reached, they execute that IMA, and then that becomes the governing document moving forward. So what that means is the village board and the town board have a say in how that plant is run and what decisions are made. And no decision is made by a single governing body. It's done at the JPC level and then brought to the respective boards to be ratified and approved. That's pretty much the difference as to why this would be a regional plant versus each municipality running their own facility and making decisions on budgets and whatnot.
Thank you, Ken. The next question is, where do the solids go from each current plant? It may take both Clem and Ken to answer where the solids go from each plant now.
Clem, do you want to start with the village, and then I would ask Pete to respond to that for the town?
Right. So the solids from the village plant are landfilled. They're taken to a landfill. I forget which one it is. There have been some issues recently in the last few years about landfills closing off the ability to discharge or take sewage sludge to their facilities. So I'm not 100% sure which landfill the village plant goes to currently.
I'll handle the town. The town currently sends their sludge to Ontario County landfill. It's located in Geneva. It's just short of it's off of Route 5 and 20, just about a little less than an hour from the town plant. That's a relatively recent change. I think as of 2018 into 2019, the town was hauling their sludge to Seneca Meadows landfill in Seneca Falls, about 15 minutes further down the road.
Okay. Next question. Is there an advantage from a grant standpoint for regional versus the village keeping its own plant? And I'm going to partially answer that and then maybe ask Ken and Clem to. My understanding is that there are grants available on either side, but that there is a larger grant opportunity because of the regionalization. For combining the two plants, there would be an advantage a little bit on the grant side. And I think that Ken is working on bringing up a quick, there you go. So Ken, I'll let you explain this one. Right after you unmute yourself.
Yep. Okay, so here's those two little guys again. So the two projects themselves, of course, are driven by one common factor, or a common factor, which is water quality improvement. Irondequoit Bay, to which both plants discharge, is an impaired water body. That means it's on the DEC's list for wanting to clean it up. Improvements to both of these plants bring money through Environmental Facilities Corporation, Clean Water Revolving State Revolving Fund. They also bring DEC money through the Water Quality Improvement Program. One program that lends itself to a regional plant, which, by the way, the EPA and the DEC strongly support because it's less infrastructure, it's less permits to administer, is this intermunicipal grant. We've talked about the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act grant, the WIA grant. Each municipality is eligible for that on their own. That caps the potential grant money at 25% of the project cost. In the case of the IMG, once an IMA is executed, that opens up the opportunity to apply for an IMG, which increases the grant amount to as much as 40% of the project cost, or up to 10 million, as opposed to 25% or up to 5 million. So there are advantages to that, to a regional plan.
Okay. The next question is, I think it's as much a statement as it is a question, but so the village would have to tear down the structures that they just upgraded. Clem, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the question is referring to the upgrades at the anaerobic digester and the treading filter. So the answer is yes, those facilities would be decommissioned. So, the digester was just upgraded, repaired in 2017, 2018, and trickling filter right before that. One component, as Ken mentioned, of the regional alternative that would be retained would be the screening and grit removal in the Headworks building that was constructed in 2006, 2007. In the plan for the regional alternative, there is a plan to upgrade the screen so that it will take out more or finer particles than it currently does.
Okay. Why don't you stay right on, Clem, for one more question, which is, did the village factor in the cost of a 4A operator?
So we did not look at, or originally we did not look at upgrading the operator certification. So just so everyone's aware how that works, treatment plants are graded or scored by their complexity, so the number of processes that are in their treatment train and how complex those trains are. I believe the village operator right now is a certified grade 3 out of 4 different levels. There are scoring thresholds based upon the number of processes that are included. If the village were to go on its own and be required to get a speedies permit and therefore add processes, the only process here really that would be new would be the disinfection. So that would be an additional 5 points, I think, to their score. So then we would have to see if that would, we haven't done the analysis yet to see whether that would increase that to beyond the next threshold to go up to a 4. Just to clarify, I know there's some confusion as to what an A versus a not A classification is. So an A classification applies to plants that use activated sludge as their secondary treatment process, whereas those plants that don't have that certification. So there's a kind of tacit acknowledgement that activated sludge is a more complex system to learn how to operate. So therefore, the education for an operator is a little bit more involved than it is for a non-activated sludge system.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions in here that I'm going to try and combine together. And one asks about the operators at the village. What happens? I think that means to those operators. The cost for the village does not include the cost of flushing lines and infrastructure. And then a question that says, since operations and maintenance and responsibility have not been figured out, how can you present an estimate of user costs? And I think that probably has been included in some of the calculations that I'll let Clem and Ken talk about. And under the regional option, are there other sewer costs incurred by the village residents that have not been presented tonight? And that may go to the collection system. So I guess maybe we'll let Clem go first on that, and then we can have Ken chime in.
So yeah, to kind of, as you mentioned, we have considered O&M for treatment only. As Ken presented in the presentation, there's a whole discussion about what happens with the collection systems, but that hasn't been included in this analysis because our focus was on the treatment processes only. So in theory, what happens at the treatment plant shouldn't affect what happens in the collection systems from a cost perspective. There are some considerations that each community would have to look at in how their internal operations are managed and how they're funded, which is beyond the scope of the engineering analysis of the treatment plants.
Ken, you want to chime in on that when it came to the regional costs?
I think the only thing outstanding was maybe the cost of the operator. Again, when we just go back to this, actually, bear with me here. So for the regional plant versus the village only plant. We looked at historical operation and maintenance, the addition of any chemical or power using equipment. Certainly there's going to be some staffing up at a larger regional plant, and we've accounted for that within the numbers. So the estimated annual O&M for the regional plant is about $2.6 million as compared to $0.65 million for the village's plant.
Okay, yeah, it was stated that the village user would be treated just like the town user. Would the town user then pay a portion of existing village debt on assets that would be used in the regional treatment plant? I think the answer to that is that there would be a split there, that the regional piece would have some components at the village and then some components down at the Phillips Road location. I'll start again with Clem on this one. I think maybe he's going to have the better answer for that one.
Sorry, could you just repeat what you mentioned?
Sure. It was stated that the village user would be treated just like a town user. Would the town user then pay a portion of existing village debt on assets that would be used in a regional treatment plant?
So for our analysis, we excluded any consideration of existing debt and just looked at the future debt that came from the upgrades to either project or either the village only or the regional alternatives. So kind of like similar to excluding the collection system considerations from our analysis, we've also excluded the considerations about existing debt from that.
Right. It's my understanding that any current debt with the village needs to remain with the village users. It cannot be paid off by the town users.
So with that comment, how will the village users pay for the existing debt?
My understanding is they'll continue to pay for it.
So it would be calculated into their rates.
Correct. So although the user costs for the treatment would be identical between the town, like regardless of whether you lived in the town or the village, the actual bill that a town or village resident pays will be inclusive of that cost plus the collection system cost plus existing debt costs.
Right. Next question up is, as a town resident, how much will a regional plant increase my taxes? I'll let Ken handle that one. We picked on Clem a couple times. I'll let Ken handle it.
Sure. So this was a slide that was covered by Barry, and the current published rate for a single family home in the town is about $173 per year, which I will say, by the way, these two sewer rates paid by the two municipalities are a bargain. They are extremely low when compared to other municipalities. That said, when you factor in the fact that this charge in the town currently covers plant operation and maintenance and some of the debt on phase one plus collection system operation and maintenance, this will be added to that. However, you're already paying some of this O&M, so in essence, our estimate is that this one current charge of 173 will go up by about 50%. So what is that, about $210 a year
Okay.
total.
So I think that, let me just see if I've got another. So right now, the current combined flows of both plants are approximately 5 to 6 million gallons a day. Why would an additional clarifier be needed when the new clarifiers are designed for 21 million gallons a day?
I would like to call a lifeline on that.
Call a friend. Mr. Baker.
It's a dime engineer.
I'm sorry, Barry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Right now, the current combined flow of both plants are approximately 5 to 6 million gallons per day. Why would an additional clarifier be needed when the new clarifiers are designed for, I think, 21 million gallons per day? That's the questionnaire is saying positive.
Yeah, so the design of a clarifier is a little bit different than when you think of a conventional, like the heart of this, the heart of the system would be the aeration tanks, the aeration process, the biological treatment. Clarifiers are largely designed based on hydraulics, so the limiting factor 90% of the time for a clarifier is not necessarily the monthly average rate. It's what's hitting the plant at any given time. It's a term we use, the peak hourly flow. The peak hourly flow during the course of a day, the flow going into a treatment plant is going to vary. It's called diurnal flow. You get a spike in the morning, and you get a spike in the evening. More significantly, during wet weather events, there's significant spikes. So that's really, when we look at that, that's the driving factor for how we have to design the clarifiers. That's based on largely the short-term elevated flows that we see into the plant. We projected during design. We had a long-term growth factor. We used a similar factor into that with respect to the clarifiers. Certainly, a lot of that, an I&I program would alleviate some of that on that end.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. There is another question in here about the grants, so I just want to touch on it so that the person that asked feels that they have had their question answered. Have there been discussions with New York State regarding financial support or grants available for the regional approach? And if so, what are some of the estimates of the size of grants? What is the estimate of decreasing the cost of the overall size of the regional upgrades necessary? I believe, and you guys, Pete or Clem and Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the regional approach grants have been calculated into some of these numbers.
Yes, starting at the town, as I mentioned earlier, the $12 million Phase 1 project has already received a $3 million WIA grant, which was capped at 25% of that $12 million. We've also made the assumption in discussions with the agencies that Phase 2 would also receive a WIA grant, which would be capped at 25% of the regional costs in this case, the 22.9. In the case, or the 27.7 rather. In the case of the villages project, and Clem can speak further to this, they already have a letter in hand that provides principal forgiveness through the CWSRF program. Plus, there's additional opportunity for that project to qualify for and receive a WIA grant as well.
So that's right. So the village did receive a funding letter. So they haven't actually submitted an application for funding yet, but essentially it's a commitment from the funding agency saying that they would provide a $1.4 million grant. And these are all based off the original project costs from the 2018 numbers of 5.7 million. And they also received because of the income level in the village, they qualify for what's called principal forgiveness and 0% hardship loan. So the amount of the cost of the project for the village residents, what isn't covered by the grant would be covered by a 0% loan.
Okay. Thank you, Clem. Thank you, Ken. While we're on that topic, under the regional plan, it was presented tonight that the grant would be much larger by $5 million. Why couldn't this excess grant money be used to justify lowering the split between the village and town residents? Doesn't this treat everyone in Webster the same? So who wants to jump on that one? I can read it again. I see the furrowed brow from Clem.
Just reading the question.
So the split, which is shown right here, again, I go back to the capital and user costs. We would look at the totality of the number of EDUs that are tributary to a regional plant in this case. And under the current EDU assessments, roughly 27% of the EDUs come from the village and roughly 73% come from the town. there's no differential there. And as you see by these costs, again, everybody, a unit within the village would pay the same for debt service as a unit in the town. Same thing with O&M. So we would take the annual costs and divide it by the total number of units. I believe the difference in user costs you might be speaking to, again, relate to the collection systems, in that there are some differences there, and there's always going to be differences there. There's some different debt service that's in place in the village versus the town. There's different debt payment structures. That is going to remain status quo. Moving forward under a regional concept, everyone would be treated equally when it came to financing debt, operation, maintenance costs for a regional wastewater treatment plant.
I'm not sure if this helps, but maybe to understand the process, the grants are applied to the total project cost, and it lowers the total project cost, no matter what the project is. Then the distribution of that total project cost is calculated between the number of users.
Okay, I think that does answer the question. So I want to just talk about a couple of things about operators, a couple of questions. What is the top grade of operator at the town plant? Does anybody know the answer to that? Maybe Pete does.
4A.
4A is currently at the town plant, okay. What would be the financial impact if the village lost the Xerox flow? We talked about this as an issue with Xerox, and so I think that you guys have done some analysis on that. Can you bring that slide up, Ken?
Let's see here. So we looked at it two ways, both for the regional plant as well as the village-only upgrade, and this considers the amount of EDUs or flow that goes to each facility. So there's been questions here about debt and operation and maintenance, and we don't have a crystal ball that's going to look 20 to 30 years down the line over the life of this facility or these upgraded facilities. However, we can make a bet that inflation is going to go up, that the municipal boards are going to want to increase their rates on an annual basis to keep up with inflation, and also to create a kitty to pay for equipment that might be breaking down that they have to maintain. So these cost curves here reflect what a village user would pay if Xerox started to lose 1% per year of its EDUs or flow, if there were no change, or if there was a 1% increase in users at that site. So you can see what's reflected here, that it does make a slight difference. It's not a lot. We're looking out ahead at the regional plant. However, it does widen the gap here because it is such a substantial user at the village-only plant. There's a wider gap. Should we start to see increases or decreases at Xerox? Pete, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a significant delta between the two, and the largest reason is the rates, the cost to operate the plants aren't necessarily going up, but what does decrease is the I guess the denominator, the bottom line in that equation is under the scenario where a blanket assumption of 1% increase, 1% decrease per year. Those EDUs at the village end, they're currently about 60% of the flow is from Xerox. So is that base from Xerox is decreased, that would lead to a relatively rapid change in the increase. The reality is, again, this is a crystal ball. This is an example scenario on that end. But what this is intended to show is that there's more sensitivity with respect to the village plant and any significant changes in Xerox flows than there would be with more users, more EDUs on the regional option. It's better suited to absorb any changes. Conversely, if there's a 1% growth in Xerox, the village rate would in turn decrease that much more rapidly as well. is shown by that bottom line.
This line graph is just a different way of showing the projected costs that Barry covered earlier with 4 bars. And if we took a look at this, the long-term expenses of, say, the regional plant to a village user with no change in Xerox, we got a pretty steady curve here. The initial cost for treatment, debt plus O&M, is in the range of about 170 or so. Again, operation and maintenance costs are going to go up. The regional users are going to be putting away money to pay for incidental equipment that breaks down, but you also offer the opportunity for population and growth within the service areas that continues to build that denominator, so it takes away the volatility of the annual cost increases. And again, this is a projection over 30 years here that the costs are going to rise, but 30 years out, they're $250. It's a very large user base. In comparison, when we took a look at the village-only upgrade, as Barry had mentioned in those graphs showed, after about 10 years or so, the two are, as we can best forecast now, based on user base and operation and maintenance, plus some additional capital investments that the village envisions doing at their plant. We see the cost to the village residents actually moving higher than that to a village user should there be a regional wastewater treatment plant in place. Again, these are projections. These are variable, and again, it depends on power costs, chemical costs, Xerox users, other users within the village and the town.
Okay, thank you. And so let me just touch on a couple of these questions that I think that we've really already answered. And that would be the financial impact of a large user or several small users occupying the Xerox campus. I think we've discussed that. I think that we've got a couple of questions here that I want to talk about. One is that I'm getting a clarification that the current town rate is $187. So I just want to mention the fact that you take a snapshot in time, and as every year goes out, those rates are always going to go up because there's costs involved in those going up. And so that rate may not be today's rate or the 2020 rate, but they were the base rates that were used, as well as the 150, which is a number that the town or the village just recently in the last couple of years went to a sewer rate rather than including it in their regular tax rate. So there's not a whole lot of history there to go on. Let me answer this one. The PERs show that the town plant uses more electricity to treat the same flow. I think you guys have already addressed this in the evaluation of the ongoing operating and maintenance costs for those two plants. So I think that you've got that in there. The current expenses to run the village plant are there, and the expenses to run the town plant are there, and then calculated based on the new changes. Let's talk about this one, which was, it looks like it would be better to revisit this in 10 years. Why now? It seems like village residents will pay more. Shouldn't village residents pay less? Well, they can. And I don't know whether that's necessarily a question as much as it is a statement. But at this point in time, the next phase, what's next is that the village board needs to make that decision and needs to decide whether or not they want to go towards the regionalization or whether they want to move forward on a separate, or continue their separate plant. And so I'm not positive that we can answer that. I think that that's going to be more along the lines of what the village trustees have to weigh and make that determination. I think that's probably why they were elected. So let me jump to a couple more. These might just be technical questions. Can the town really force the village to not be a partner on its Speedies permit? And I think that this was probably already talked about when Clem gave his presentation with regard to the village going out on its own. And right now, if I'm not mistaken, the village is a Speedies report or to the town Speedies permit. And in the event that the town wanted to separate from the village wanted to continue. Since there aren't redundancies currently in the village, the town felt strongly about the need for that to come off and go on their own Speedies permit. So Clem, can you just talk about that for a second? This is, I believe you've told us in the past that this is an unusual situation that the village is really inside the Speedies permit of another municipality. And I'm not even positive that anybody else even has such a thing in our DEC. So can you talk to that for just a second?
I don't believe that there is another situation like this in the state where a municipality discharges into the outfall of another municipality which holds the Speedies permit. However, it is akin to what happens very frequently when you have, say, an industrial user within what's called a publicly owned treatment works. So in that case, the municipality that has the Speedies permit has has an obligation basically to protect the environment. So they have the ability under the environmental conservation law to force industrial users to comply with certain upgrades to make sure that they don't disrupt the capacity or capabilities of the plant and or discharge pollutants into the environment. So I see this as a very similar situation where the Speedies, the town holds the Speedies permit, and they have a responsibility to maintain that, to comply with that. And the laws that they have similar through the SOU to an industrial wastewater discharge permit. Now, most industrial wastewater discharges don't have a full treatment plant that can essentially treat all of their waste to the same standards as a Speedies permit. Usually, they have what's called pre-treatment processes, which lowers the pollutant contents to more like what you would see in normal sewage, like domestic sewage coming from a residential area or a commercial area. So that's really the biggest difference, is that infrastructure is already in place for the village, such that it can meet all of the requirements of its own Speedies permit, with the exception of the disinfection component.
Okay, I want to just jump back because one of our participants has felt that we filtered a question. So I don't want anybody to feel like questions are being censored. I'm just trying to group them together so that we're answering them in some sort of cogent way. The town plant uses 2.5 times the amount of electricity for the same amount of flow. And I think I mentioned that we have costs for both the village plant and the town plant have been calculated into the estimated O&M, and those numbers are reflected in the graph that's currently on this sheet. Is that not correct? That the current costs have been calculated for the plant, for the village, and for the town based on existing expenses. Is that correct, Clem?
I know that we've calculated that for the village-only side, and I believe that B&O, Barton Legudis, has done that for the town and for the regional alternative.
Just to elaborate a little bit, with respect to, we have part of the PER, we report the existing electrical consumption. I think we pulled it out of 2017. One year we show what the plant uses electricity wise. As flows go up, certainly the consumption of electricity is going to go up. The process that's been selected for the town's plant, there's a limited footprint for expansion. Most of the electricity is driven by the aeration process. They use blowers. There's a limited footprint, so the actual process that we selected is typically going to be a little bit more energy intensive than a trickling filter would be. It is designed to more efficiently treat an ammonia, a nitrogen nutrient loading with that, but there's basically, we need to operate at a slightly higher DO to kind of enhance that. The primary reason we selected the technology we did on the town's end is just limited footprint for expansion. It's a process where we can provide a media, so it's almost like a hybrid between the trickling filter that the village uses and a conventional activated sludge process, but it does inherently use more electricity in that end. Electricity is a cost for operation. It's not certainly the largest cost to operate a plant.
I mean, part of the upgrades, again, is this last bullet, energy efficient equipment, premium efficiency motors, plus instrumentation control. Right now, the aeration process at the town is all in. It's highly inefficient. There are no dissolved oxygen probes that work variable speed drives that control the blowers in proportion to load. So that said, any new equipment going in here is going to be have modern instrumentation control systems that are operated off of process parameters, offering tremendous energy savings over what's there now. Not to mention the premium efficiency motors and the diffused air system that would go in there.
Okay, thank you. And this question, if bigger is cheaper, can anyone explain why the town processes 3 times the flow of the village for more than 4.5 times the cost? I think again that we have addressed that in the existing expenses and then the projection out. And so while there is a difference, the new plant is going to have difference, and those have been calculated in by the engineers. Would the town allow the village to go to the town in 10 years from now? I'm not sure who should answer that question. Maybe I could have the town supervisor come on. Or Ken, did you have a comment on that?
I would just say from an engineering standpoint, again, this phase 2 town plant, which I'll go to here, if it were town only, is going to be sized to handle about 7.2. It's not designed to handle the flow and load from the village. And I guess in working with the town board in discussion with the village board, this is kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity here. It is an opportunity, which is why it's been brought to the village at this time.
So, Ken, just to paraphrase what you just said, would be that the changes necessary at the town treatment plant to do that are going to take place in phase 2 of the current upgrade. And if we go 10 years down the road and phase 2 has been done with only the town in mind, then we would be missing out on that opportunity. And we don't know what the costs would be to modify the plant at that point in time.
Correct, and it's going to be a lot more cost effective to do it all at once, because anything done in the village in the future would be done purely for the benefit of the village user base, and therefore all debt associated with that would fall on the village. There would be no benefit for the town to do that at this point or at that point.
Okay. How many EDUs would the village lose if Xerox went offline? I think that's on our pie chart one. Right now, if Xerox goes offline, there's 650 EDUs going into the town plant and 4,126, a total of 4,761 going into the plant now. If that Xerox campus shut down and was shuttered completely, then I believe that would take away 4,761 EDUs. Correct me if I'm wrong, either of the engineers.
It's my understanding there are some flows from Xerox. They have a remediation system, so I think there are some base flows from Xerox that would still continue, but it would be significant. It would be over 4,000, to say the least. It may not be 100%, but it's going to be close to it.
I think it's also worth mentioning that if Xerox goes away, there is a component of the cost that's involved in that too, because the flows are also reduced. But I don't know if that is there's a linear relationship to the EDUs and the amount of cost that's associated with treating that flow.
Okay. The regional plant, capital investment for the life of the study for 20 years. This question says there has been no additional capital investment for the life of the study for 20 years, and the village plan included phased-in approach. Is this realistic? So can you talk about, Ken, maybe start with the regional plant in the life of the plant for the study?
Yeah, so there were two different PERs that were put together, of course. The approach that Barton and LaJudas took with the town was to basically take a holistic look at this plant and look at all unit processes and identify what needed to be replaced. Our our experience tells us, just by the availability of funding, the sheer amount of time that it takes to run from the planning process through funding, through design, through construction, as you can see, it's a 4 to 6 year process. To do that again for another project that might be forecasted to be 5 to 10 years out, you're essentially coming back to the residents 2 years after you just constructed the improvements and you're bringing the plan to them for the next upgrade. That doesn't usually fly too well. There is an asset management approach, which looks at condition and severity, and I guess that'll set up Clem's response on how the village took a look at their system.
So we took the asset management approach in terms of looking out beyond the life of this project for the village upgrade and seeing, what additional costs would be potentially coming due in the future, because we're looking at a plant that is not brand new. So the project wouldn't necessarily, although it's touching a lot of the systems, it wouldn't replace everything. And we know that there's equipment that's been very efficiently run by the operators at the plants, probably beyond the original design life of the equipment and the processes, but at some point they will break down and they will need replacement. They may not need replacement now, but they'll need replacement at some point within what we call the planning period. In our case, we took a 25-year look ahead from 2017 and said which processes are going to break down. So we budgeted that so that we could present to the village on a year-by-year basis, what can you expect to spend, what can you expect to fail and need to replace or rehabilitate over that period. We then suggested or provided a suggested investment plan that looked at where did these costs hit, when do these costs hit. Some costs it makes sense to kind of build up a reserve fund, capital reserve fund up front, which would be built into the user cost, the O&M charge, which is, I believe, the town has one right now that it uses and has used for some of its kind of unforeseen replacements and upgrades that are necessary. So that would be one approach. Another approach would be if you had a lot of those expenditures in 1 year, maybe it would be a better financial deal at that point to lump them all together into a capital project and then bond for them. As Ken mentioned, there's considerations that go into that approach as well. But we presented that to the village board as saying, here's one scenario that you can look at that separates those two out. So when we look at future costs within the PR that we put together, we had projected 2 projects, capital projects out in the future that would be necessary based on the equipment that hadn't been upgraded in the 2017 recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Clem. I want to kill a couple of questions here. These numbers represent treatment only and do not provide a complete picture to the actual cost to village users. Has there been calculations to the total actual cost? I think that goes to the next question, which is, will the village still need equipment and personnel for the collection system? And I think there was one more question about the collection system, which was if it's better for regional, if it is better for regional for treatment, why wouldn't regional collection be better? So I think if you back up a couple of slides, Ken, I think we can put that red line between the two that you talked about when you did your presentation. One right there. These two, when the system upgrade was calculated, the numbers do not include the town collection system or the village collection system. Those would need to continue, and then they would be billed out separately to the village users and the town users. Is that correct? Am I making that clear, or am I not thinking correctly here?
That is
That's
correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that. So we can pull that question out. And this question is, I want to make sure it gets in there because it's as much a statement as it is a question. So to plainly state this, The engineering firms are recommending the regional plan. Is this correct? I won't put either of you on the spot. And I will just preface by saying the engineers were hired to study and analyze the needs and the costs for the village and for the town in its plans, phase 1 and phase 2, and then look at a regional approach. I do not believe that either of them have said this is the way to go. They've just presented the data to the trustees that are going to make that decision. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think one thing that we stated at the beginning is that this is a presentation on the treatment plants and the alternatives we looked at the treatment plants. There are other considerations that both boards would have to consider, which we aren't necessarily well placed necessarily to speak to. So I don't think that we could necessarily make a recommendation without having the best information as to those considerations. I think those considerations have to be more carefully adjudicated by the boards themselves.
Okay, let me be cognizant of our time. I believe that we planned on around 90 minutes, so a couple of things that I want to get to. Some of these questions that we're getting from one of our anonymous attendees are a little bit repetitive for questions that have been asked earlier, so I think mostly if that person goes back and looks at the tape, they'll see some answers to some of their questions. One of the things that I want to back up to are the non-monetary. Can you bring that slide up for me, Ken? One of the things that I want to talk about briefly right here is that there are future revenue opportunities both for septage, which was used in the past in the village, and waste gas to energy, which I believe has been built into the town's plant, that there's the potential there that some gas could be captured and used for energy, which might offset some costs, something that could happen in the future. Can you just comment on that, Ken?
The current phase 2 plan and costs include improvements to the town's current or existing septage receiving station, which they have in place, and capacity would be designed into the upgrades to accommodate a certain amount of septage per day, per week, and so on. This waste gas to energy system is not currently in the proposed improvements beyond having the anaerobic digester capacity, which is there. What would have to happen to make that, to implement that, would be accepting probably some high strength waste, which is where the revenue would come from, capturing and holding the additional gas generated by that waste, and cleaning that and running it through a new generator that could then be connected to the power system at the plant, and that would basically offset power that's being purchased from the grid. That system in itself does offer grants beyond those being considered, be it through NYSERDA or other energy-driven grants. So that wouldn't be implemented until that were further studied and there was funding available for that.
Okay, a couple of questions on debt. What role do the Penfield users have in the town treatment plant debt? I believe that they are currently being billed, and the debt service is included in the rate that goes to the Penfield users. And I think that we covered that. There was 2 questions. What happens to the town treatment costs if the town does not get the grants? The same thing that would happen in any situation where somebody doesn't get the grants. I think that if the grants weren't there, then you're going to have to spend more money to do what you want to do. And I think that's a fair assessment to say that costs would go up if you didn't get government grants, and that would be the case for any municipality. Am I correct in that, Ken, Clem?
Correct, and it's typically up to the municipal board to gauge their residents on and determine what's deemed affordable, and unless and until that grant threshold is reached to reach the target user charge, typically a municipality is not going to move forward with the project.
The town has, and I don't know whether this is an accurate statement or not, but the town has had difficulty replacing a retired operator for 3 years. Is a grade 3 operator easier to find than a grade 4A? I don't know if anybody on the call right now is qualified to answer that question, but I'll leave it up to Clem and Ken. You guys are in the industry.
I mean, just in general, I'd say that the higher grade level is more difficult because there are fewer people who are certified to that level.
I would agree with that.
Seems to make sense. And again, this question about the village users would pay for new debt and still pay the existing debt on the headworks that's used in the regional plant. Doesn't that seem like they're paying twice? And I think that that's been calculated into your numbers. And again, we talked about the fact that existing debt was pulled out of these, so that the collection system and existing debt would still be serviced by both the town side and the village side. And then I just want to see if we can get close to time because we're 1 minute over already. Why wasn't the town-only plant shown on the long-range treatment cost chart? I think that the charts were designed to show what the impact of the Xerox would be and the regional plant. I don't know whether that was just an oversight or whether that was just, it wasn't something that was done intentionally. I think that we just didn't do that evaluation. Is that correct, Ken?
Correct, as the main focus of this informational meeting is for the village board and village residents to ultimately allow the village to make a decision to move forward with regional or not.
Okay. Let me see if I can get rid of the rest of these quickly. Is the regional plan a village-only decision? I've heard in the past town meetings that the town didn't care either way, and it was a village-only decision. I think that you just mentioned this, Ken, that this is a decision that the village needs to make to decide whether or not they want to move in on this opportunity to come on board for the regional approach. If the village decides not to, I believe that the town then proceeds with their phase 2 upgrades and moves forward. I think that was discussed in a couple of our meetings that we had the last couple of days. How much money does the village have in the STP reserve fund currently? I don't know if anybody is able to answer that question. Maybe if Jerry or Mayor Byerts, Trustee Ippolito, do you have an answer to that question?
Yeah, that would be zero. We do not have that.
The village does not have any STP reserve fund currently. Okay. This one says great presentation. Thank you all. So that's an easy one to take off. If this is a town, let me see this. Okay, I'm a little confused by this question, so I think it's just a question of if this is a village-only decision, how is the town appropriated funds for the engineering? So I think that when we got to the point where we were going to look at engineering regionalization, the two engineering firms came together. That Clem is working on the village contract and Ken is working on the town contract. So I think that those costs were appropriately allocated to each of the engineering firms. And in a regional plant, would the regional entity secure the debt or would individual members? I'm not sure I understand that question. Ken, do you have a comment there, or Clem?
From what I've seen with joint projects, or in this case a regional project, if you recall the slide here on the IMG grant, it indicates that although bound by an IMA, there is one single municipality that has to serve as the lead municipality for an application of funding. Typically, the way these would work under the IMA is structured is you got the total project cost, you got capital cost allocated to each municipality. They have to have their individual bond resolutions, and then any funding could be done on an individual basis, or it could be going to the lead entity. All that's eventually worked out in the IMA. So it can vary, and also varies on the funding program.
Okay. limit time, and I got a couple of questions coming in from our anonymous attendee. So I'm going to cut off the questions at this point because I think they're answering a little bit more detail that I think that maybe could be answered on the village level or specifically to the engineers. So will the village have an open forum before the vote? Trustee Ippolito, can you address that, or Mayor Byers, either one? Are you there, Trustee Ippolito? I know we've kind of run over our time. We thought we were going to finish up around 8:30. So that would be one that if that anonymous attendee sends in an email to Trustee Ippolito or to Daryl Byers, he'll be able to get an answer to that. And I think that's going to conclude. We have roughly 50 some odd questions. Yes, Mayor Byers, go ahead.
What was the question? I'm trying to unmute and kind of lost.
Okay. Will the village have an open forum before the village trustees vote?
Yes. We will have an opportunity for discussion at the next village board meeting. We're not voting until first meeting in September.
Okay. All right. So I think that that's going to conclude. We've got a couple of questions, but again, I think that those can be answered either at the next forum. This was trying to get as much information out as we can, and some of these questions are pretty detailed. So I think that we're going to call for a conclusion at this point. I'd like to thank Clem and Ken for their presentations. I'd like to thank the trustees from the village and from the town council for coming on board. I think this was great. It was very informational. I know that over the last couple of days when I was asked to moderate, I learned a whole lot about this project. And I'm grateful that the engineers were able to answer a lot of questions so that I could do what I did tonight and hopefully imparted some knowledge on some of the village residents and the town residents so that people can make an informed decision and that the trustees can make an informed decision. So with that, thanks to the two engineering firms, to the town and the village. Thank you all for letting the Webster Chamber of Commerce participate and hopefully move this project forward no matter what happens. So thank you all, and unless anybody else has any comments, we'll close the webinar and say good night.
Thank you all. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.